Hey chess players, today we're going to look at the top 4 or 5 endgames for beginners that definitely come up um, quite often, and you will do well to know them. Starting off, the most important of all is the king and the queen versus the king. Um, I'm going to teach the simple method at the beginning, which is when the black king, in this case, the defensive king, is not on the edge of the board, we can make these L-shaped patterns to control where the king goes. And this is useful for knowing how to do something called making the box smaller. So if he plays this square, okay, it, it's still the same thing. I mean, I have a lot of good moves, but take note, in this case, he only has one possible move. Here, we get to a big moment where the black king actually only has one move or two moves, but both of them are against the edge of the board. Now, when the king is against the edge of the board, that's when the checkmates start to exist. The only checkmates that do exist are when the king is against the edge of the board in these cases. So when the king is against the edge of the board, we should do something called the cutoff. So no more L-shaped moves, just cut the king off, and you'll be ready to play checkmate by getting your king into position and then playing checkmate. In this case, we have two different checkmates. So to sum it up, I can take any arbitrary position, put this king on the most difficult square right in the middle. First step, make an L shape. I should say an L distance away from the king, a knight's move away from the king. I'm repeating that pattern. Uh-oh. What do you do in this case? You see what I did there? Aha. Oops, excuse me. It was like this. Aha. So there is a way to make progress. And here, now he's not going to go volunteering to go against the edge of the board. So let's say he does this. We can finally do the walk down. And eventually that king has to go to some edge of the board. When the king is against the edge of the board, do the cutoff. And this way, there will never be the possibility of a stalemate. The black king already has a bunch of squares. Just never do this. Don't be too consistent with that L-shaped pattern because you'll do a stalemate. So do the cutoff, and once his back's to the wall, we can get our king into position and then play checkmate. So once more, the prisoner's walking back and forth, waiting for the execution, and just like that, there's a checkmate. Okay. Now, I will say these are not the most efficient and quick ways to win the game. This is just something to help you be able to get the job done. There are faster ways to do that checkmate. Optimal play with a king and a queen versus a king. Put the pieces anywhere. At maximum, it should be 10 moves. In those examples, it was probably a few more, but that is something to get you started. So with the rook, it's similar, but there's actually a big difference. With a rook, we get this mechanism where at certain moments there won't be a way to improve our position. With the queen, we can always make the box smaller and push him around. With the rook, we actually need the king to help. But the first step is similar. We make the smallest box around the king, and then I get my king into position, and I make another box, smaller. Oops. So in this position, we get the first moment that I would call a waiting move, where we're just putting the kings in opposition and essentially looking to see what black does so that we can make the box smaller. If he goes this way, I can go this way with the king. So a double step of the king, a double step of the rook. This is common. Notice here how I got 2 rook moves out of that, and then I'm going to play 2 king moves. So that might be another helpful way to remember this. Eventually, just like with the queen, the king has to go against the edge of the board. The only checkmates that exist are when the king is against the edge of the board, and we can then create checkmate patterns. So here I make the box smaller. It's not stalemate. I call this the perfect box. He only has 2 places to go. And then it would be a big mistake to go king here because that is a draw. It is stalemate. Instead, I should walk around this way, double step the king, and finally checkmate. So to sum up how to checkmate with a king and a queen, you're making a box with the rook. You're bringing the king in to help make a smaller box, to facilitate making a smaller box. And then the king is going to jockey for position to help the rook make smaller boxes until eventually the king is against the edge of the board. And essentially the pattern repeats, but it's a double step of the king. And just for fun, I'm going to show a slight variation on it. In this case, there's a type of move I haven't shown yet. It's just a waiting move. I want to play rook here checkmate. His king is too close. If it were black's move, he would play king over, and then I would play checkmate. So this calls for a waiting move. I can just wait. He goes over, and then checkmate. So with the rook and the king, at certain moments, you will need to play waiting moves to gain position. That is the king and the rook versus the king. Next up, we have the king and the pawn versus the king. With the king and the pawn versus the king, we really have to get a firm grasp of a concept known as opposition. Opposition being when there's an odd number of squares between the kings, and whoever is on the move has to lose ground. In this case, the king can take control of the square the black king was once at. So the key to this, the easy way to think of it, is that we have to gain opposition to take control of the touchdown square on e8 in this case. So we should move our king first, not the pawn. If we move the pawn first, the game is actually a tie. Many games end this way because black is the one that's able to maintain opposition. This pattern of waiting to see which way white goes is going to repeat if black plays well, and knows to do the waiting game. So in this situation, whichever way I go for white, black can match that. If I play other random moves, then he will play his king in front of the pawn, and this is the drawing technique in chess. Indeed, you could say that this is why chess is probably a draw. Certain positions where you have extra material just cannot be won. Anyways, in this situation, the pawn gives a check, and then white has nothing better than stalemate. So this was a failure for white. In this situation, he should not push the pawn first, but instead rush the king forward, and then take the opposition. Once the black king moves to the side, we do something called outflanking, which is essentially clearing a path for the pawn to move forward. I can do opposition again. I can do outflanking again. And finally, like in the other examples, when his back is to the wall, we see a bit of a change with the rule set. I don't do outflanking in this case. It's time to get on with it and push the pawn, because observe the timing. I have opposition, and now I have control of 3 crucial squares. We'll go ahead and play through once more the checkmate of the king and the queen using our L technique. Once the king's against the edge of the board, I want to play the cutoff, but in this case I cannot. So you have to be flexible with some of these rules. I can do another L move and then do the cutoff, and behold, I have the perfect box. You can only go back and forth, and then it's checkmate. But in brief, we'll summarize the situation with a pawn and a king. The only way to win for white is to ultimately get a pawn to the queening square. But to do that, it's very helpful to get opposition with your king and then outflank him. It's worth mentioning that if it's a rook pawn, there's no way to outflank him. I can't move my king over here, guys. I can only go this way. So that actually means that we can be in a situation like this where black doesn't even leave the corner. He just stays up here. And once I get into an opposition, this outflanking is meaningless because then he'll zap forward with his king, eventually winning that pawn. And if he goes, well, he would never go the other way, but if he did go the other way, even this is a draw because my king is going to be stuck in front of my pawn. So ultimately, we get to positions where the pawn gets up there, and there's just no way to push him out. If I could go king to 0-0 or 0-7, whatever you want to call it, if I go king here and push him out of there, I could queen the pawn, but we have an edge of a chessboard. Okay, I hope that helps with some basic definitions of what is basic opposition and outflanking in the process of queening a pawn. I will also leave you with this concept that if the king is against the edge of the board, we have a slight breakdown in rules where even if it's white's turn and he doesn't have the opposition, in this special case, he can push the pawn, which puts black in opposition, and then a special move known as the big clamp. In this case, black is being pushed out from in front of the pawn, and we get ourselves another victory with a double step of the king, and then the waiting move, and checkmate. Okay, next up, for the last position I'm going to give, it's going to be for a defensive task, and in this situation, this is known as the Philidor technique. The chess master from France, Andreas Philidor, I think his name was, is credited with the discovery of this defensive technique, which is, I would say, the most important rook and pawn endgame. The first rook and pawn endgame that you should learn is when you're black and your back's to the wall, how to hold the position. And the secret is something called cutting off the king, this time for defensive purposes. So yeah, how can white make progress? Well, if he goes rook here for the trade, I hope that you know that this position with king straight back is actually a draw because we can take opposition. So it is not to trade rooks. Well, it doesn't really matter what white does, but he can go for pawn here. This is the sneakiest move. He has a plan to put his king in the pocket on b6 and then maybe go for a checkmate. And if black does nothing, he would eventually lose the game here. This is a very bad situation for black. Threatening checkmate. He goes on defense. Rook here, and white is going to win this game because of this check. So black has to do something called active defense. He just can't wait for white to make progress. And the way that black makes the active defense after the pawn to c6 move is a very key move. He goes rook to rook behind the pawn. He goes as far back as possible. Rooks are a long-range piece. So he gets back here and gets ready to check from behind. Now white does have a nice situation by virtue of the fact there's no way to check the king, but that's okay. We can use passive defense here. Just wait. And if white ever goes for that same technique of around the back, then he will be harried from behind. And this is the main idea of the Philidor defense, is that once the rook's behind the pawn and the pawn is pushed up to the 6th, there's nowhere for this white king to hide from the checks. And even if by some miracle he did this block, we know that we can transition into a draw by doing this waiting move and seeing which way white goes to get to the draw. So to sum up, it's not that difficult of a concept, but if it's black to play in general, he needs to establish the cutoff on the 6th rank. You shall not pass. And this pawn can go forward trying to create a block, a shelter for the white king from whence to attack on the back rank. At that moment, we need to switch back and attack from the rear. And yeah, there's nowhere for that king to effectively manage the dual task of bringing this rook up here to deliver the win and at the same time protect his king from harassment from behind. So that is a draw. That is the Philidor technique. And those are the top 4 or 5 positions that I would say, let's say 0 to 1500. If you know those, okay, you're good to go. Um, Maybe we'll add some more later. Over and out.